Villains make up some of the most iconic characters in all of media. I think everyone has good reasons for their personal favorite. So what makes a villain great? And why was one of my top villains written out before the story even technically began? Welcome to this week's video. My name is Pei, and today we're exploring the fantastic world of villains through the specific lens of my favorite, Suguru Geto. Suguru Geto is a fascinating villain because you could argue that in Jujutsu Kaisen he's not the first, second, third, or even potentially fourth most important antagonist. I'll cover that later in more detail with a spoiler warning. But what makes Suguru such a fascinating villain is that during the main arc exploring his character, he doesn't really exist as an antagonist. Jujutsu Kaisen's filled to the brim with great characters. I think it's actually the story's strongest component. Yet somehow, the most recognizable character throughout the entire series outside of Gojo is arguably Suguru. Maybe the primary cast is definitely debatable, but the fact that he's had such a large impact is fascinating. I mean, literally, one of my good friends who doesn't really watch anime has had her background as Suguru on her phone for the last couple years.
Yep, it's true.
Outside of this character's success in both the anime industry and in the specific show, he's also a personal favorite of mine, which is remarkable considering how many great villains are in anime. So that's the question I want to answer. Why do I love Suguru Geto so much? And that begins by first unpacking what makes a great villain great. There's no definitive answer on who the best villain is in media, but I do think if you have this discussion, there are certain characters that repeatedly come up. So what I want to do today is explore what makes great villains so great. These are traits that aren't synonymous or necessary to make a good villain, but they are all present in one of my personal favorites. So we're going to explore all 7 through examples from a range of different media, predominantly from anime, but occasionally dipping into live action. Then we're going to dive into how these traits apply to one of my favorite villains, Suguru Geto, while also exploring the fascinating place he has in Jujutsu Kaisen's story, and how watching the show in a different order might lead to a significantly better viewing experience. And to remember these traits, I even came up with a mnemonic. So today, let's use tactics to explore a villain's best traits. Starting first with Chapter 1, Terror. Antagonists, and in their more specific subcategory, villains, can serve very specific goals in a story, the obvious one being that they are an obstacle to challenge the protagonist. But we'll get to that in a second, because the first thing we're focusing on is when villains are terrifying. There are many different examples of terrifying villains. It's one of their most common traits. But few are as strong as one of the best villains in all of anime and manga history. Johann Liebert from Monster is a name you might be familiar with without understanding why. His character is consistently listed near or at the top of people's most iconic villains in anime. Monster is filled to the brim with convoluted and fascinating characters and twists. It's a dark and intriguing story that, while not for everyone, has aged very well, and its most consistent component is the terrifying antagonist at its center. The story follows a doctor named Kenzo Tenma, who makes a moral choice to save a young boy when given a corrupt order to prioritize a local mayor over the patient on the verge of death waiting for him in the other room. Turns out that boy has a complicated future and even more complicated past, growing up to be a terrifying monster. It's the title of the show. What really makes this character so interesting isn't just that he's one of the most terrifying antagonists and villains you'll find in media, but specifically how he's written to be that monster. Anime is filled to the brim with antagonists that have overwhelming strength and absolute power. And as you'll see, I'll argue in a minute, antagonists also often have striking appearances and aesthetics, given their limited time on screen. Johann's character is terrifying not just because he's capable of killing people, but because he does it with zero remorse or gratification. Unlike sadistic antagonists people often see, Johann acts from a cruel and disconnected place. He's a mastermind on the edge of what people can even really define as existing. A major component of this story is how many people don't even know if Johann really exists. And that's enhanced immensely by his brief but incredibly impactful moments on screen. There's rumors online that despite the show's 74 episodes, Johann only speaks for a grand total of 30 minutes. I've not corroborated that, but what I can say is that his time on screen is brief, but his presence in the story is constant. As part of doing research for this video, I checked out some of the many great video essays on Johann Liebert, and given this is just a brief look at the character, if you're interested in him more, I'd suggest both Friendly Space Ninja and The Masked Man's videos on him. But ultimately, the most terrifying component of Johann's character isn't what he does, but what he gets others to do. It reminds me of a quote recently I got from a friend in him explaining his favorite villain. That despite being capable of horrendous things, his greatest evil comes in what he says, and more specifically, in his case, what he convinces people to do. Fear is such a compelling tool for crafting an antagonist. It can cause such a visceral response from the audience, creating a unified experience for both the protagonist and audience. It's a major component of why Johann Liebert is one of the all-time greats. The second trait we're exploring today is aesthetic. A major reason why Johann Liebert's character is so terrifying is because of the juxtaposition between what you would expect from a villain and what you got. Antagonists and villains fill a fascinating place in stories as the counterweight to the protagonist, meaning that they have to fill a lot of space in a story despite having significantly less screen time than their counterpoint. Because of these limitations, audiences very often are forced to judge a book by its cover, or more accurately, fill in a bunch of gaps. Along with their appearance, villains are often defined by a few grand, devastating actions. So with this limited time to make a big impact, a villain's aesthetic is incredibly important. I'd argue that villains as a category have some of the best character design in all of media. But it's more than just the way they look, it's the way they present themselves, their voice, their aesthetic as a whole. I mean, years ago I made a video talking about how Silco from Arcane is introduced and how sometimes the difference between heroes and villains is perspective. I mean, Silco has an iconic villainous look, and at the centerpiece of that is his eye, which has not only significant story structure, but is used in his introduction. In the scene where we're introduced to Silco, he is a silhouette, a terrifying threat. And before we even see his face, we get a very visceral act of him injecting some medicine for that eye. It's distinct and causes an immediate response. It sets an immediate tone in what role this character is going to fit in the story, but it goes beyond just his appearance, the way he navigates the story, the way he's written, his voice actor. All of these are fundamental parts to what I would consider a fantastic antagonist. And it doesn't stop there. There are so many villains that are traditionally and distinctly evil looking. Scar from Lion King, the Joker from The Dark Knight. But aesthetic can come with complexity too. Like I talked about with Johann, or the iconic villain from One Piece, Doflamingo. This guy's definitely evil, but he's so distinct in a way that's incredibly memorable. Aesthetic is a core component of all of my favorite villains, especially when it's tied into bigger things like the way they're written, or their place in the story, or maybe the other traits we're about to explore next. At the core of every antagonist and villain is their role as a harbinger of conflict. Stories are completely dependent on conflict to progress the plot and give characters room to have arcs. There's a classic literature device called conflict types that you're probably familiar with. Person versus person, person versus self, person versus nature. So villains are often the manifestation of that type of story conflict. Not always, but in many cases. Once again, take for example Johann from Monster. Part of the reason Johann is so terrifying is because despite being a human, he actually represents so much more. Person versus the unknown. He's this enigma that's ever present and suffocating. A monster that doesn't function on the same rules of killing that we do. Because he's so distant and cold, it gives him an air of unpredictability. He's almost a Lovecraftian creature, thus the name of the story, Monster. This is true of another antagonist we'll be talking about later, Lady Eboshi. She represents person versus society. But my favorite example is Askeladd from Vinland Saga Season 1. A real bastard. Someone that despite terrible traits is still charming and in some ways likable. An agent of destruction and a focal point of revenge, the sole focus of our protagonist Thorfinn. What makes Askeladd such a compelling villain is that he's the entire plot. A very soft spoiler warning for those who haven't seen Season 1. This is a story centered around revenge. Thorfinn doing everything within his means to grow stronger so he can challenge and eventually kill Askeladd. What's fascinating is that Askeladd's character is enough to carry that entire premise. In many ways, he's a bastard, but he's also kinda likable. He's consistent and brutal, not someone you're at all rooting for. But in the first season, he's by far the character with the most substance. Askeladd is a single individual man, and everything Thorfinn does is in pursuit of overcoming him. He's a perfect harbinger of person versus person conflict. All villains serve the plot, because consistently they bring problems the protagonist has to face. Think about Scar from The Lion King. Everything happens because of him, from the betrayal of Mufasa and Simba running away. Even when you consider the decision that Simba makes on his own, it's all a byproduct of the actions Scar has taken. Nala leaves looking for help because of the way things have gotten. Great villains are not only obstacles, but fantastically satisfying versions of that conflict the story is choosing to engage in. Which leads to our next trait. My favorite antagonists and villains in stories always come with a bit of texture. While characters often have defining traits, the way they interact with one another is what adds a lot of depth to what they offer to the story. While villains are often scary, aesthetic, and harbingers of conflict, sometimes they're also charming or compelling. I love when good antagonists in stories are far from single note, when there's something about their personality that really catches. Hans Landa from Inglourious Basterds is a perfect example of this. He's about as evil as people can be, a literal Nazi detective during World War II. He's terrifying and capable, an agent of chaos and conflict. While he's actively working against the protagonists in the story, he's not afraid to jump ship, always prioritizing himself over others. While Johann Liebert is cold and disconnected, and that's what makes him terrifying, Hans is the opposite. It's a game to him that he's very good at. He cares significantly more about the challenge than the morals. The opening scene where we see the full range of what his character can be, the incredibly famous one. It ends with him letting a girl get away, one that's incredibly important and comes back later in the story, one that he immediately plays games with again when he runs into her as an adult, from ordering milk for her as a reference to that initial scene to letting her keep her cover. His brutal actions are always carried out with an air of nonchalance, except for one scene when he's legitimately tricked and hates it, the betrayal voicing itself in anger, Hans uncharacteristically getting his hands dirty. This character is textured. There's depth to him that evolves past he's a bad guy doing bad things. His self-interest and joy in this conflict adds so much, especially given the remarkable performance by Christoph Waltz. This movie's filled to the brim with iconic moments, but without a doubt the most iconic part of it is the story's villain. Texture voices itself in many different ways across villains in modern media. I think we've generally seen a movement away from single-tone antagonists. Whether it's texture or complexity, we've seen an increase in fascinating villains across media. Not that they haven't been around for a while, I just love a lot of modern antagonists. Now, texture comes in personality, aesthetic, like Askeladd being likable despite just how much we dislike him in the story. Oxymoronic traits that don't necessarily have to do with the evil itself, more so the presentation. But also sometimes antagonists are intricate, the philosophies they carry being defensible even if you don't really agree with their actions. Which leads to our next trait. Sometimes good villains are intricate. If you were to ask me my favorite story and antagonist growing up, I'd say Princess Mononoke. Of all the outstanding Miyazaki films, for some reason this one has always sat with me. And I think it's because of its intricate antagonists and on a wider scale, conflict. Once again using types of conflict, I think Princess Mononoke is person versus society. Violence is the lowest common denominator to escalating conflict between two parties. If there are things two people care about enough that conflict with one another, eventually it will escalate. And Lady Eboshi represents that in such an interesting way. She functions for her people and their preservation. And it is a noble cause, a perfect example of agree with the philosophy but disagree with the decision. While there are many different obstacles for our protagonist Ashitaka, from an emperor that exists off-screen to the very real Lady Eboshi, this story delves into the consequences of conflict, violence, and hate. Because while war is sometimes necessary, there are no winners. Lady Eboshi's a fascinating antagonist because of her complexity. She's not only textured, but also incredibly intricate. She's charming and powerful, and there are worse villains around her. And in many ways, she's fighting for an incredibly noble cause, taking in the unwanted of society and providing them a home and safety. But her solution to that problem came at the expense of another, the forest and therefore nature, in this case represented by the very real talking giant animal gods. It's very easy to justify violence against a third party in an effort to protect oneself. But this can be an incredibly slippery slope that results in an ends that never justify the means approach, following that cycle of becoming another perpetrator of unjustified violence. The reason Lady Eboshi is such a fantastic villain is because she's so lovable, not just in texture, but to the core of who she is. When villains are convincing on a deep, fundamental level, lines start to blur between what is good and bad. And sometimes stories play with perspective to trick audiences. Once again, Silco from Arcane is a perfect example of this. A character that's portrayed and acts in extreme violent ways that actually offers significantly more intricacy than it first seems, forcing the audience to reassess the assumptions they made based off the very negative presentation the story introduced him through. Because in reality, very few people think they're a villain, and I think those are the most compelling characters. So the second to last trait we're talking about today is contrast, specifically when villains contrast protagonists, bringing out the most interesting dynamic between the two, otherwise known as being a foil. To me, this is another common and effective trait of great antagonists and villains, one of the most famous and beat-to-death examples being the Joker from The Dark Knight. Everything about his character really truly challenges the Batman, not just in capability, but specifically poking at the holes in Batman's philosophy. The Joker isn't afraid of dying, therefore Batman is put constantly between a rock and a hard place. This character is one of the most popular and obvious examples, but good foils are all over the place. Even just staying in that genre of superhero villains. Marvel isn't just doing that thing where Ant-Man's villain is just bad Ant-Man or Hulk's villain is just bad Hulk. They actually often have some of the most compelling foils. I think it's fascinating that one of the main villains for Superman, arguably the strongest superhero, is a rich guy named Lex Luthor. But the example I want to use today to explore a fantastic foil comes back to Jujutsu Kaisen. But we're not talking about Suguru yet. Jujutsu Kaisen is built around a central character named Gojo. He's very important to the show and therefore this video. Gojo's a little bit like Superman, born into the world with two incredibly broken powers, working together to be even more broken. The main part of the story we'll be exploring later with Suguru Geto is called the Hidden Inventory Arc, and this is where Toji's introduced, one of my favorite foils. Literally, one of the first videos I made on this channel was talking about how Toji is a perfect counter for an OP protagonist in Gojo. Toji functions the opposite of Gojo, born into a magical world without access to that magic. Instead, he ends up with something called a heavenly restriction. So while he has no cursed energy, he has inhuman strength and speed. He, not just despite, but because of those limitations, is the first person that beats Gojo, pushing him when no one else could. A mix of using his temperaments against him, reading and predicting him correctly, setting up traps and circumstance that give him a huge advantage. Toji beats Superman, and it's awesome. It makes complete sense. That's a good foil. Toji feels like he was crafted to highlight the most interesting parts of Gojo, and he's not the only one, but we'll get to that in a second. The final trait we're going to be exploring today is skill, but much more specifically, limited skill. A pet peeve I find myself often annoyed by is when antagonists are incredibly strong but then decide just not to kill the protagonist for no reason in a way that's immersion breaking. Often good villains and antagonists are skilled, more capable than the protagonist, but have limits as to why they can't just wipe them out. I love when that's balanced well. Once again, we're going to look at another antagonist from Jujutsu Kaisen as an example. One of Jujutsu Kaisen's main strength is its characters. I love how many strong villains and antagonists they have in the story. So despite how much I've talked about Gojo and Suguru, the main character in Jujutsu Kaisen is named Yuji Itadori. He's thrown into this crazy magical world when he consumes a cursed relic, remnants of the strongest curse in history, Sukuna. And much like Naruto carrying Nine Tails, these characters are now intertwined. Sukuna is a beautiful example of an incredibly capable antagonist that's also very limited. He acts as a total agent of chaos, bailing out the protagonist in multiple terrible situations, but that never comes without severe consequence. In the past, I've talked about how important it is for protagonists to have interesting faults and limitations, because they often force and create an environment for good writing decisions. Limitations breed creativity. I love the way this story explores Itadori being a vessel for Sukuna, especially considering Gojo's place in the story as functionally all-powerful. There are moments where things go really wrong for Itadori, and Sukuna offers a solution, but not without significant cost. This dynamic of a skilled but limited villain is wonderful for creating escalating conflict, forcing protagonists to consistently grow at the edge of their limits, forced to overcome challenges within their reach in a way that's not immersion breaking. Now, the reason I brought up these 7 traits is because not only did I find it fascinating to look at some of my favorite examples of villains in media, but specifically because I really wanted to understand why I love Suguru Geto as a villain so much. There's a very strong argument that he's not the best villain in anime. I mean, honestly, there's a very strong argument he's not the best villain in Jujutsu Kaisen. Despite that, though, I do think that he's one of my favorite characters, an outstanding example of writing, kind of discovered in a really interesting place. Manga in most cases is written week by week, serialized chapter by chapter, and given how hard it is to get a series greenlit, a lot of mangakas, like television writers, focus more on creating an engaging hook rather than fully fleshing out a story before trying to get it approved. This to some degree necessitates discovery writing, figuring things out as you go. This is common in television writing, in lit RPG, in manga, and in Jujutsu Kaisen's case, it's a crucial component of what makes Suguru Geto so interesting. You see, before Jujutsu Kaisen was even greenlit, Jiji Akutami wrote a short series called Tokyo Metropolitan Curse Technical School. A mouthful, I know. This was eventually changed to Jujutsu Kaisen 0 after Jujutsu Kaisen got picked up in 2018. And it functions as a prologue to the story. While there were tons of familiar characters, its protagonist was different, and technically, so was its antagonist. At this point, to dive deeper, I need to give a soft spoiler warning through Jujutsu Kaisen's Hidden Inventory arc, which is the 5th episode of the 2nd season, before the Shibuya arc in season 3. So despite Suguru being very present, he's not actually the main antagonist in season 1. Characters thought he was dead. He has this huge scar across his forehead. It turns out that character is not Suguru, just a villain using his body. He's who I'd consider to be the primary antagonist of the anime, especially early on in the series. We also have this large threat of curses that manifest that the Jujutsu sorcerers have to fight. There's a couple of really strong ones at the top, specifically one named Jogo, who I'd consider to be the 4th most important antagonist in the first 2 seasons of Jujutsu Kaisen. Then there's the big bad curse stuck in Itadori's body, Sukuna. He's incredibly important, but also very limited. I'd consider him to be the 2nd most important antagonist in the first 2 seasons. And finally, there's Toji, a character specific to the prologue in Hidden Inventory. So that leaves Suguru somewhere amongst them. And what makes him such an interesting character is that during Hidden Inventory, he doesn't really fill an antagonistic role for a majority of it. You could consider it the origin story. In Jujutsu Kaisen 0, he is the primary antagonist, where we see his story resolved. However, what makes him such an interesting antagonist is that the way Jujutsu Kaisen released was Season 1 into Jujutsu Kaisen 0, the movie, into Hidden Inventory, and then the rest of Season 2, and finally Season 3. But I think that this specific order has the tragic capability of undermining Geto's arc. I know it did pretty drastically for me. If you ask online, a couple different forums suggest reading Hidden Inventory before Jujutsu Kaisen 0. And I strongly agree with this, because to me, Geto in Jujutsu Kaisen 0 is a good villain, but with the context of Hidden Inventory, he's an outstanding one that functions beautifully within all 7 of these traits that I've introduced. So let's look at Geto's story and how he fulfills these roles. As a terrifying aesthetic villain that serves the conflict, how he's so textured and intricate, his philosophy being almost defensible, functioning as a beautiful foil for one of the few characters that irrefutably is more popular among the fanbase than him. All of this while being skilled but limited. And the beauty of it is that so many of these traits intertwine with one another, layered together to make this fantastic character that was almost fixed in retrospect, that didn't exist until this prologue was written, crafting something new that shifts all of what was written before, while tying into important central themes. Geto's character is fascinating, and it starts happy. A fundamental question explored in Suguru Geto's character is how someone can go from advocating for the weak to disdaining them. Part of what makes Geto's character so fascinating is not only that he fills a fantastic role as a villain, but also that he has such a good arc and origin. If we look at Geto's role in Jujutsu Kaisen 0, the movie specifically, I think he's a very strong antagonist. But then if we take that exact same character and place it in the context of Hidden Inventory, I think it's enhanced greatly. In Jujutsu Kaisen 0, Suguru is introduced with a very clear goal: to kill all non-sorcerers. He sees them as lesser, literally comparing them to monkeys. This is a classic make the bad guy bad by having him do bad thing. Now where this character starts to get interesting is how he engages in those 7 traits I introduced. His goal is not to kill the protagonist of the movie, or at least that's what it seems at first, because it would actually immensely benefit him to convince more Jujutsu sorcerers to help with his plan. That, in conjunction with him being one of the few special grade sorcerers out there, leads to a skilled but limited character, especially given the fact that he has a more powerful counterpoint in Gojo. Geto's character in this movie is scary, and part of the reason for that is the texture. At points he's nonchalant and charming, but it's all built over this festering hatred, which initially seems like a masquerade. But we'll find out later it's more complicated than that. That's only one of a multitude of reasons why he's terrifying. He's unafraid to leverage Gojo's students against him. He's ruthless in the way he regards human life, and he's striving to achieve this goal with absolute pursuit. Doesn't really seem like anything's off the table. Geto's design is also incredibly aesthetic, built around this kind of false idol. He wears monk's robes and acts as a spiritual leader, but is ultimately working to eliminate humanity in the way we know it. Now, the character design for Geto in Zero is more aggressive than the rest of the series. There's a ton of these evil, smirking villain moments. But his aesthetic is more than just his personality and appearance. It's also that he uses curses as a tool, despite being a sorcerer meant to fight them. This will be very important later. We're going to bring it back up. A lot of the conflict in this story is built around limitations despite capability. In the middle of the movie, Geto approaches Gojo's students, in one part to try to convince the main character to switch sides, but in another to declare war on Jujutsu Sorcerer Society. There's kind of this underlying goal throughout all of this, but for the sake of this video, that's not actually very important outside of it progressing the plot, creating conflict for the main character and his side. Now, the first moment where we really start to see the intricacy of Geto's character is a flashback where we see Gojo reminiscing about how Geto used to be the opposite of who he was today. Gojo was kind of an armchair revolutionary, and Geto was discouraging him, stating how important it was for the powerful to defend the weak, a seemingly complete inverse of his stance now. Mix in a very important scene, not only for Jujutsu Kaisen 0, but especially for Hidden Inventory that they play in both, and you get the hints of a really intricate character. Geto, when announcing his separation from society and goal, asks Gojo a question. Are you the strongest because you're Satoru Gojo? Or are you Satoru Gojo because you're the strongest? Because I think at the core of Geto's character is his dynamic and relationship with Gojo. This scene that's played in both stories is a really good example of how the Hidden Inventory arc really enhances Geto's character. And the way it does it is by answering that question. How do you go from someone who advocates for the weak to one that disdains them? It's all built around a slow but beautifully crafted descent. Hidden Inventory jumps back to when Suguru Geto and Satoru Gojo were students at Jujutsu Tech, the prequel to the prequel. It starts with two incredibly powerful kids with huge ideals. Gojo's power makes him aloof. Like I said earlier, he's a bit of an armchair revolutionary. They're both aware of the huge flaws in Jujutsu Sorcerer Society, a corrupt system run by people incredibly out of touch. And the story follows these two as they're assigned a job to protect a girl who's destined to be a vessel, to sacrifice herself for the good of humanity. These two characters are strong, contemporaries standing side by side, unsure if there's anyone even out there stronger than them. They're arrogant, young, ambitious, and passionate. As they get to know this girl, they realize maybe it should be her choice, not society's. She's torn between her responsibilities and wanting to live. And in this arc, we get to see who Suguru is. He's charming and playful, an advocate for those who need to be protected. He resists Gojo's reckless revolutionary ideology out of reasonable fear of the fallout. He believes in a solution built in compromise. And then they face Toji, one of Jujutsu Kaisen's best antagonists, a character without access to cursed energy who uses his capabilities to the fullest to overpower two of the strongest people in the world. In this fantastic set of fight scenes, we see Toji come out on top multiple times, shattering Gojo's seeming infallible ego and stealing away the opportunity at living a full life this young girl decided she finally wanted to actually grasp. It's a soul-wrenching failure that both Gojo and Geto have to sit with. And in this chaos, Gojo and Geto have to rebuild their shattered understanding of the world. An incredibly important part of Gojo and Geto's arcs are their powers. Gojo has access to something called Limitless, which literally almost makes him untouchable, and a second equally powerful one called Six Eyes. His powers are not only overwhelming, but in the way they express themselves literally put him above others. Geto, on the other hand, literally has to consume the vile curses he's fighting. Consuming them is a disgusting and uncomfortable process. While Gojo's powers create an almost godlike presence, Suguru's pull him down to the filth, reliant on the monsters they're meant to fight. Gojo's fight versus Toji awakens something in him, really truly pushing him to his limits, forcing him to grow rapidly, and in the process leaving Geto behind, where he's isolated and forced to face the brutality of losing his peers, serving a corrupt society and protecting people who can't see accurately what's going around them, who find scapegoats to punish because of that lack of understanding. Like his powers, his circumstance drag him down, forcing him to dredge through the evil that the society he's perpetuating produces. The trauma of continuously losing those around him, being forced into isolation and with expectations to save those around him. He's pushed and pushed to a breaking point, and he snaps. We see this full journey from carefree to broken, before finally finding a philosophy that he thinks could lead to something better. Gojo and him now trading places. Geto assuming that solutions can only come in the extreme, and that it's better to pursue that full-heartedly and to fail than to do nothing. I think this origin story greatly enhances Geto's character in Jujutsu Kaisen 0, because it turns out there's amazing answers and depth to all the things that are hinted at, and this was all written in retrospect. There's so much more that can even be explored with Geto's character, like how he acts as a foil for Gojo, who's also fantastically written. Like that there's major implications that their relationship is more than just platonic. Everything about this character is fantastic. My favorite part of Jujutsu Kaisen is hidden inventory, and it's not even close. But I just find it tragic that I watched Jujutsu Kaisen 0 first. The moment where it finally really hits just how good of a villain Geto is. The story skips back to the present and moves on. To me, the first time I watched it, it felt like they threw away anime's best villain, all of which was predetermined before he even started writing hidden inventory. It's maybe why I have such strong emotions surrounding the way he's written, because a good villain becomes one of the best ones if you just change the order in which you consume the story.